Norwegian-American migration. So they'll tell us a little bit about what they learned about the migration and some insights from having taught this class over such a distance. So I'll turn it over to Kyle Ward, who's from Minnesota State University, and Jens Johan Hyvik, who's at the University of Southeast Norway.
Yes, I don't know, shall I start, Kyle, or?
Yeah, please, would you, Jens?
Okay, so then I'll just share my screen. 1 second. You see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so Kyle Ward and me, we co-taught this class about Norwegian migration to the United States in the spring 2019. And let's see here if I can just have to move. So what our plan today basically is like this, that the first part, about half an hour plus maybe, we'll talk a bit about the project that financed this course, very short, and we will talk a bit about the course itself. And then we will focus a bit more on the 2 study trips that was included in the course. One trip to Norway in May 2019 and one study trip to the United States in March 2019. And while we talk about these study trips, we will include something about also the emigration from Norway and the immigration to the United States, about the Norwegians that came there. So we'll kind of try to do this as we also talk about what we did in the course. And maybe at the end we will talk a bit more about the student experiences with the course. We will also try to have a good time in the end for questions and answers. So the reason why we are cooperating, Minnesota State University Mankato and the University of Southeast Norway, is that we made a program that we got funding from a Norwegian organization, state funding organization, for internationalization of education. We started our cooperation in 2016 when we and some of my colleagues visited Minnesota State University. And then we applied for this funding in 2017. We got the funding. And we have had this project going on for 2 years. The project then ended in March 2020, but we also have now started a new or applied for a new project, and we hope maybe we'll get funding for that too. This project we made basically had, it was 2 activities that we focused on. The first activity was practice or observation in Norwegian or American schools for social studies teacher students and history teacher students. So it was so that was kind of a very important part of the project. And the other activity was this course that we wrote the article about, that you probably read then in Norwegian-American Studies. So Kyle, I don't know, will you talk say a few words about the course? Do you want me to stop the sharing, or I can do that maybe?
So yeah, when we the grant allowed for Jens and I to go back and forth a little bit there, spend some time in each of our different universities, and we started laying out the plan. We had to come up with a syllabus. One of the things we decided to do is actually we taught 2 parallel courses. So he was teaching a course over there at the same time I was teaching a course at Minnesota State Mankato, and it made more sense that way. Jens and I are also very proud of the fact that we were very, very, very cutting edge. Well before the pandemic, we were doing Zoom and online teaching and stuff like that. We weren't forced into it, so we had a little experience before that all started to come together here. And then we just kind of tried to come up with an idea. What was interesting for us is, on the one hand, we had a bunch of American students who knew absolutely nothing about Norwegian history. And we had some Norwegian students who probably knew some stuff about American history, but maybe not as in depth. And the goal of being is that we're going to bring these two groups together to have them research this exact same topic and see if we could figure out what the push factors were and what the pull factors were with that as well. Before I pass it back to Jens, a couple of things that jumped out at us that we hadn't really thought about when we first started doing the syllabus is I got a cultural lesson, and maybe Jens did too, between our two countries, because all the different breaks that we had for our different schools and our different countries and different religious reasons and stuff like that, they obviously didn't have Martin Luther King, but Norway has a longer Easter break than we do. So it was kind of interesting trying to piece those two things together. And then the other thing we found out during the semester is our time zones. We switched time zones. We did the fall back. We sprung ahead while they stayed the same. So we had to force the Norwegian students to changing stuff very quickly on their end too. Jens, I'll go back to you here.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, we had some really nice experiences that we just had to figure out as we moved on with the course. Okay, so as Kyle said, we did the Zoom meetings. So we had basically one meeting every week during the whole semester, except from some weeks that we couldn't because of holidays and so on. But then also we had these 2 study trips, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. And we'll start with the study trip to Norway, which kind of was the last one. That was in May, but we will start with that now because we thought it's nice to kind of combine with the immigration part, and then Kyle will come back to when the Norwegians came to America afterwards. So the aim with these study trips was that we wanted the students to get a deeper understanding of Norwegian immigration and why the Norwegians emigrated. And in a way, it was about that the study trips, as you know, it's about that you can kind of see it and touch it, and that we are not just talking about it and learning about it theoretically, but actually going to the places and seeing the places where it actually happened. Beside this, as you kind of mentioned maybe, Guy, it was also an aim with the course, a kind of cross-cultural social aspect to let the Norwegian and American students meet and get to know each other. And we might come back to that later also and talk a bit about that. Just a few words about the emigration. You might have seen this before, but to remind you, it was kind of the first immigrants came in 1825, but it was only in the 1860s that kind of we get the first big wave of immigrants going from Norway to America. And then you have a new wave in the late 1870s and 1880s, and then a new wave in the early 20th century from 1900 and a few years after that. You also have a wave in the 1920s, and there are also immigrants coming after the Second World War, but we don't go into that now. If you look at this map, this is a map of where the immigrants came from in Norway. And especially the first immigrants, they usually came from the mountain areas inside the country and partly deep in the fjords of the west coast. Later on, the immigrants also came from the more central regions along the coast, and not least here in the eastern part of the country from Oslo area and so on. But as you see in the map, the darker the color, the higher the percentage of immigrants that left Norway. So you see basically the darker colors are more inside the country, you can say. Well, let's move then to the study trip. I don't know if you see the map here. You see the red dot. That's basically Bø, and it was in Bø that that's one of the campuses of the University of Southeast Norway, and it's where I also then work. And it's around 2 hours with train from Oslo, or also driving from Oslo around 2 hours.
I'll put the top of you. It's that so the Norway meaning.
It's
Or you just found what you wanted?
It was on sale.
Excuse me.
Would you please mute your microphones? Please. Thank you.
So most of the time we spent in Bø, but when the American students arrived, they arrived in Oslo, and they also stayed a few nights in Oslo also, and then went to museums there. When they came to Bø, we rented cottages where they were staying, and we also had students coming from other parts of Norway on online basis and so on. So it was also Norwegian students in the cottages. So it was a kind of nice social experience too. So one of the most important question when we had our classes in Norway, it was basically, why did the Norwegians leave? And well, there are several reasons for that. But one of the reasons that often people talk about, it's like basically life in Norway was pretty hard. And the first emigration also then came from the rural districts, which were kind of overpopulated in the last part of the 19th century in Norway. But later on also from the cities. I'll come back to this later, but this thing about life is hard, was hard, we'll follow it a little bit. Because just in Bø, where we spent most of our time, it was also quite a few people leaving for the United States. And we visited one of these tenant farmers places that is just outside the center. And here you see some of the students sitting, and Kyle, actually sitting on what's left of what was once a tenant farm. This is not really from a tenant farm, but it's from the local museum in Bø, where they also have these goats going around. The goats, they were very popular. But we of course couldn't only be in Bø, so we also traveled around a bit, and we went up to a place called Rjukan in Tinn municipality, that is kind of deep inside the mountain areas of Telemark County in Norway. So then we are, and it's a few hours drive again then from Bø that you saw on the map. Rjukan is down in this valley here, and it's kind of a pretty remote place today, and it was a very remote place in the 19th century, I think we can say. It was the reason why we went there is that it's actually one of the first places where quite a considerable amount of people did the emigration. And I think the first group of people, they left in 1837 already. So they are pretty early to start the emigration. And they have a local museum in Rjukan, kind of in the middle of the valley here. And we visited the museum and visited the houses, some of the houses where also they have moved houses. This is a collection of houses. And in some of these houses, actually people lived that traveled to America. So people could go inside the houses and kind of get a feeling of the life that people used to live. And not least, of course, driving through the landscape gave you kind of a feeling of these pretty remote places where you kind of had to struggle pretty hard to live, especially when the population grew as it did in the 19th century in Norway. But we, of course, when we went traveling in Norway, we couldn't only deal with emigration history, and in Rjukan is famous for other things too. It's actually a company town that was built up in the early 20th century because of water, electricity power, and they have a very famous place here called Vemork. And the reason why it's kind of one of the reasons for its international fame is because of it was a very important sabotage operation there during the Second World War, because they were producing heavy water at this place. And to stop the German plans for developing an atomic bomb, it was a special ops operation here, and they basically blew up the production of heavy water. At that time, during the Second World War, it was a huge building in front of this factory. And later on, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, this building was demolished. And just a few years ago, they started to dig down to the basement and see if it was anything left of it. And they found the original basement of the building still kind of under all the rubble. And now they have opened the new part of the museum inside this basement. And that's why you see the picture of the students here. And I think actually you see me here and Kyle. And we could go down there and see where they made this heavy water. I think that was actually one of the things that the students really liked to go there and see that. We then continued our trip up to Rauland, and that's kind of even deeper inside the mountain areas of Norway. And at Rauland, we also have a campus at my University of Southeast Norway, a campus that deal with this, most of the study program. They are dealing with kind of folk culture and folk music. And we have a Canadian fiddle player here that is called Laura. And she's from Canada, and she had a lecture for us about her research about the Hardanger fiddle players, a group of Hardanger fiddle players in America. But we also tried, when we were up in the mountain region, to have a kind of traditional Norwegian dish. So you see the students here are getting a traditional meal, and you can see what it is. It's basically meatballs, I think we had. Okay, so why did the Norwegians leave? Norway an important fact is that Norway basically had the second largest emigration of population emigration in Europe. So it was a lot of people emigrating from Norway. But was really the main reason because life was hard, as we kind of could see, also the students could see when we did our study trip. Well, as I mentioned earlier, some of the rural districts, overpopulated, and there also was an economic depression in the 1870s and 80s that added on the emigration. But if we compare, and much of the late research in the later period of time has kind of focused on this, that life in Norway was not harder than any other place in Europe, basically, for common people. So the main reason that researchers think today that the emigration happened and why so many people emigrated from Norway was that America basically pulled, that it was things in America they found attractive and they wanted to emigrate because of that. Basically, the pull factors were more important than the push factors from Norway. And we can also add then that contacts that when first emigration started up and was going on, there was a lot of contact between the emigrants and the home country, people at home. And this so-called Amerikabrev, as you might have heard about, and so on, and also reports in the medias and so on in Norway. So this contact made sure that the emigration also continued, that people were reminded of the good things that America could offer. So probably that was the main reason why so many people emigrated from Norway. Here you see also a group picture of both the American and Norwegian students as they were at the Norwegian study trip. Okay. Then Kyle, I leave. You can take the word and talk about the.
I'll jump in here. Okay.
Yes.
As I'm getting this set up, Jens, help remind me, in Oslo, when we got there, we spent about 2 or 3 days in Oslo before we met up with your students. Is it the Norwegian Folk Museum? Is that where we met your colleague?
Yes, you visited the Norwegian Folk Museum, which is a huge museum. Probably if you've been to Oslo, you might have been there. It's just outside the center, and it's a huge collection of buildings from all the districts of Norway, basically. And the ambition when they built this folk museum was to kind of try to put into a museum the culture of the rural areas of Norway, like how common people lived in Norway. And it was built up from around 1900 and onwards.
I know
it's a big, huge museum, outdoor museum.
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge, huge area. If you haven't got the chance, I would highly suggest when you get there, go look at that. One of Jens's colleagues at the university, who is kind of an expert, and I know he's done some work with that museum as well, was able to come up and give my students a tour. And that was something that my students to this day, when I talk to them, they still come back to that. They thought that was really interesting, having him kind of go through and do a little bit more of an in-depth explanation of the things that were there too. Something else that we had the opportunity to do, and you can kind of see in one of the pictures I have here, and one of the pictures that Jens showed too, when they came to Minnesota and we went there, we were able to bring in some of our colleagues. Dr. Lori Lallam is giving a talk here on my left here, when the students came from Norway to Minnesota. We also, because we were doing this cutting edge Zoom technology, stuff like that, we had experts from other parts of the country. We had a University of North Dakota professor come in. So it wasn't just Jens and I giving lectures every single day. We had a lot of really top-notch experts who came in and talked to our students as well. And no matter how much Jens and I would like to brag about how wonderful this class is, he was totally correct. The goats won the day. We couldn't compete with the goats. That was what drew. There's more pictures out there of my students with goats than anything else that took place. So what I want to do real quickly is just kind of run through some of the pull factors. So on the one hand, on the left side, you see one of my colleagues teaching a class for my students. The other one, I was really proud that we got a chance to do this. As soon as the Norwegian students got here, literally that night, the Sons of Norway Lodge here had a quote unquote traditional Norwegian meal for them, with the hope, and the conversation that we got started afterwards was this a traditional meal for Norwegian students coming here? Or was this more of an Americanized version of what we think a Norwegian meal would be? Jens and I can maybe talk about that later on, but I kind of got the sense that the food was kind of there, but like the presentation and the time and having all that together at the same time didn't quite make sense to them. They're like, why are we eating all this at the same time? So, and then personally for myself, to answer the question of why somebody with the last name Ward is talking about Norwegian immigration, the Norwegian side comes from my mom's side. My great-grandfather came from the Trondheim area. So that's my connection to the Norwegian immigration and culture. But the students, what we wanted them to do is to understand, okay, what were the pull factors? What brought them here? And if you study in the United States, immigration is going to be a major, major topic that we're going to have to deal with. One thing I like to point out before I talk about the three major reasons that we had here, and I tried to point this out to students as well, is technology hit at the exact same time that this immigration is going to take place, and steamships. So transportation improved vastly at the same time that people from Europe, specifically Norway, were looking to go to new places here. Two images I like to point out here. One on the bottom right, if you're into genealogy, this is one of those very important documents. This is the ship manifest. And so we tried to get some students from the US here who could trace their family history back. We had no success with it when we were doing it in the class here for my students. But this is going to be where that documentation is going to come from, saying who entered this ship, where they landed, and where they came to, and where they came from. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is actually in Mankato. As I was talking to Jens earlier, this is one of those things I get to now highlight when he brings the students back, because we now have a state historical marker of steamboat landing. And it was the bend in the Minnesota River where Mankato is built around. And this is where the steamship came and docked. And so we had a lot of immigrants, a lot of Norwegian immigrants who would leave the steamship here and then travel out farther west into the Dakotas, into Iowa, western Minnesota as well. The book I like to highlight talks about this, and I'll mention him again later on, Professor Lovell, who wrote the Across the Deep Blue Sea. One of the things he highlighted in here is that not every Norwegian came through Ellis Island. In fact, it's probably a majority who went through Canada rather than coming through Ellis Island. the stereotypical images that we have here. But the three main things that we try to get across to the students for the pull factors. One, and I'm doing these in reverse order. This one probably had the least impact, but it did have an impact. We know from letters and diaries and stuff like that later on. But the American political system, what was happening in the US, what they had been hearing from letters being sent home from other people and other promotional materials as well, is that you could come here and you could get involved in politics. All you had to be as a white male at this point in time to get involved, have more say in politics. For us in Minnesota, the classic work on this, if you get a chance to look at this as well, is Scandinavians in the State House. In Minnesota, they had a really, really interesting book. Basically, the argument is from the Civil War to about the 1990s, the governorship in Minnesota was controlled predominantly by Norwegian, some Swedish, but a very strong Scandinavian connection throughout here. So you can see when these immigrants come here, they get involved in politics right away at the city level, at the county level, state level. And then a little bit later on in the 1900s, Minnesota Scandinavian population make a little bit more of a name for itself at the national level too. The second reason we discovered that they were leaving Norway and coming to the US, what they were talking about, is for religious reasons. So here's that really traditional American belief story that people are leaving their homelands for religious persecution so they can follow their own religious beliefs and stuff like that. We found that to be fairly true here. There were some, I don't know if I should call them sects, but splinters of the Lutheran Church in Norway that were being persecuted. They felt that the Church of Norway was being too much of an overseer, and so they want to split off. You'll see there are some Quakers in Norway as well. They're going to come to the US. One of the things that I think is important to note here too is that you're not going to find this Lutheran utopian community, but you will find communities that will kind of have this certain bent to it in terms of its religious beliefs along the way here as well. By 1865, so by the end of the American Civil War, you'll find that we already have 5 synods in the US. So as Jens pointed out, really happy to see that earlier, it's after the Civil War and you really start seeing those numbers start to spike, especially by the 1880s, when we're going to have more Norwegians coming here at that point in time. But you will already have these 5 synods. And with that, there seems to be this tradition of, we'll call it debate and discussion. I don't know how many Lutherans are out there. I don't know if we can appropriately call it fighting in our own churches, but we'll just go with debating and discussing different beliefs and stuff like that. And so the Lutheran church just kind of keeps splintering. I need my friend Jens to show me how to take a picture of a map and put that on here. So that's his job for our class in the future. I wanted to show you a picture of Mankato with all the little dots on it. But in our community of about 50,000 people, Mankato has 26 Lutheran churches in it, with the most recent one being a Sudanese Lutheran church, which I think is really interesting. The pictures I'm trying to show here, which I find really interesting, the top picture is from a church in Mankato called Mount Olive Lutheran Church. And I like this one because the sign they have out front is blocking literally the picture that you can see to the bottom, which is Christ the King Lutheran Church. So literally physically right across the street from each other are 2 evangelical Lutheran churches who at one point in time couldn't get along well enough here. So they divided and literally went across the street from each other. So 2 of the larger Lutheran churches in town are split that way. So you kind of see this being brought with this mentality of disagreeing amongst church members and leaders and stuff. And then the last one I have, and this is going to be the biggest reason of them all, getting farmland or economic opportunities as well. They weren't all farmers, but it's going to be a large percentage of them are going to be coming over as farmers here. The 2 pictures that you can see up there are the one on the left is a replica of the old soddies that they call them, the old sod house. I can't officially call this one sod house because you can see there is some wood on the sides of it here as well. There's some better pictures out there. But the picture on the right, and unfortunately it cropped, this is just outside of Mankato. And you can see this is the prairie. So what happened in 1862, they passed the Homestead Act, which probably had the biggest impact on population and immigration to the United States of any other legislation the US could have come up with. In a nutshell, 1862, they told anybody you come here, you can get 160 acres of land at free or very cheap prices. Vast majority of farmers in Western Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas are going to be able to trace their family lineage back because of that 1862 act that allowed all these people to come in and do the farming. I like to point out, and this is why bringing the Norwegians here and driving them around. So literally where I'm sitting right now, if I look out my window, there's an open field. There's a little wooded area. And then beyond that, that's where the Great Plains are really going to get kind of started. And so you're going to see more farmland like this, wide open spaces. Jens had showed, and this was another thing that really stood out for my students when they went over. When we were in his hometown of Bo here, where he's teaching, I should say, they took us up into, and Jens and I can go back and forth on this because the Norwegians laughed at us because my students went up to this area and said, this is the biggest mountain they had seen. And the Norwegians laughed heartily at the mountains that the Americans were impressed with. But when they looked at the tenant farm that they saw, what they saw is the remnants of a house that was inside of this steep hill that seemed rocky, really difficult, even in the 2000s to get up to, seemed to be a little bit difficult to get to as well. So we were able to juxtapose that this is where they were, this is where they were from, and then this is what they came to and saw. So you've got this vast open territory that they're going to be able to start building up all this farmland and everything else like this along the way here. And it wasn't just farming. We're going to find a vast majority of Norwegian immigrants are coming to the upper Midwest. Minnesota still claims to have the largest group of descendants. So we have more people on the census claim to be Norwegian American or have that ancestry than any other state. But you also find out in the Northwest where lumber industries were recruiting. So Washington in particular, but somewhat in Oregon as well. And then I think somebody mentioned as we were talking, New York, and very specifically in Brooklyn, New York, you found a very large Norwegian American population growing there because of the shipping. One more time here. So with our students, that was kind of the big goal. Let's get them to understand what were the push factors, what things were going on there, and then what brought them here. And it was to a certain extent the politics, the political climate that we had here, the system that we had. We had the religious freedoms that they didn't feel they could have, and then the big one here being the farmland and the economics. I saw you had this up here. I just wanted to put this up here too in case you both things, again, this is why we were happy that we were able to partner with the University of Southeastern Norway, because the stuff, when they came here, we're going to have more access to the NAHA resources. We didn't get to the Norwegian American Genealogical Society, but they're willing to work with us in the future here. We took a field trip. We spent a day. We went down to the Vesterheim Museum, which I think was really beneficial for both groups to see that as well. And just on the off chance you don't know of him, Dr. Ode Lovell, a friend and colleague of mine over at St. Olaf, who's been retired for a few years, look up his name. He's written more and knows more. I always tease him, but he's forgotten more about Norwegian immigration than I'm ever going to learn at any point in time here. So, all right, Jens, I can send this back to you if you want to comment about how we wrap this class up and what we were doing with it. Jens, are you on mute still?
I am so sorry. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kai. I was just saying that maybe we can end this session by talking a little bit about the student experiences. We tried to kind of to sum up what the students told us after the class. And basically, I think, as you see here, many they liked that they also had to work with a paper. They chose a topic to work with. That was something they liked. One thing that we did that was, I think, a bit creative, that was that we read also a novel in this course, Odd Røllvåg's Giants in the Earth. And for those of you who have not read it, it's a very important novel about basically a family traveling and arriving in America. It's mostly about arriving in America and how they establish their life there. So it's and by reading this novel, I think that added a lot to the course, and also that was something that the students commented on. They had a good experience when it came to the cultural and political understanding, and as you talked about, also they heard people, also experts, not only Kyle and me, also other professors and other people who have worked with the topics, and they got a nice experience with it. I think it's also nice to that they actually commented that to learn about the emigration of Norwegians to America actually also gave them some kind of deeper understanding about emigration today in the world today. And I think we both thought that that was a very nice thing, that actually we managed also to make the topic very relevant till today in a way. I don't know, Kyle, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think that kind of sums up what I had.
Yeah. Okay, shall we open up for questions then?
I have a question. This was very, very interesting. It's kind of a two-part question, if you don't mind. I'm just wondering, when you talk about people coming over as immigrants, which obviously my family did they have to know someone in order to come to either through Canada or Ellis Island? Or could they just say, okay, I want to come over, but no one's picking me up, I don't know who's there? Or do they have to have some contact here in the States before they're allowed to come? That's part of my question. And then I have a second part to that. So depending on what your answer is.
Jens, if you don't mind, I'll take that one.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, there were no rules. You did not have to make any kind of contact. You got here, you had to be able to set up for yourself. What happened though, this is in Minnesota at least, an organization known as Lutheran Social Services is going to develop from the group of churches, and they're going to kind of help set up. So when you came to some of these spots, there would be a group there that would help you kind of get started, making sure that no one was ripping you off when you were buying stuff, helping you with some language and things like that here. So there were contact points that they had set up sort of officially.
Thank you. Oh my God, that was my second part of my question, because I've been researching, and my mom apparently came over, and it says Uncle name picked her up. And I thought, I don't know who this person is. It's not in my family tree, but he was a member of the Scandinavian church in West. She came in through Ellis Island, lived in Buffalo. But that church was out of Lake Shore. And now that you've said that, I'm wondering if that church, because he also picked up my aunt who did not know him, but they called him Uncle. If they and I thought, did this church just send people out there to pick up these people and get them settled back in? So that kind of answers my question, because I thought there is no Uncle William Hagen that I can find anywhere. And I thought it's got to be, maybe that's what they called him. But he was a representative of the Scandinavian church. So thank you. I think that probably makes more sense than trying to find who this guy is relative wise. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be my guess, that it wasn't somebody necessarily related, but more than likely either the community came together, the church came together and said, when the next ship comes in, the next group of immigrants come in, let's help them by doing this, this, and this for them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Boy, has that been a load off my mind. Thank you.
You know, there were
Go ahead.
Norwegians who had traveled back and forth from the U.S. One of them early on was Clay Peterson, who I think there were probably other Norwegians who provided information to immigrants for where to go and who to contact and that type of thing, and potentially where to settle, where were Norwegian communities at. So did you find a number of people like that in Norway?
Yes, I think actually one of the main reasons why this early immigration happened from Rjukan or Tinn, the place I showed you in the presentation, it was just because one of these people who actually I think also traveled together with Glenn Pearson came back and kind of mobilized people to go to the United States. So that was one way definitely to mobilize people to go. And as you say, it was also kind of certain hubs that people usually went to first in America, and then they moved on from there on. So they kind of knew where they were going when they left the country. One way also to go was that people that had emigrated also sent tickets back to them, or money for tickets to go to the United States.
I'm familiar with the practices in Denmark and Sweden. I wonder if Norway had the same thing where they were agents of the ships, agents of the railroads in the United States that would sell the tickets in Europe, and at least for Danes and Swedes at certain periods, they knew exactly where they were coming when they landed in the United States. So my great-grandparents came in 1869, and they knew all the way from this little town in Sweden that they were going to end up in a little town in Illinois, that most people wouldn't have heard of. So I'm wondering if there was something similar in Norway.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the similar system. It's a bit beside your question, but so the question is, yes, it was a system that was similar. And many people emigrated that way. And it's nice to kind of add another story, and it also actually happened that the local municipalities in Norway paid the tickets for people, and then especially if it was people who were on like social benefits, like and we have quite a few examples of that in a way, as this we have the protocols of the Board of Social Affairs, and they are discussions, shall we pay the ticket for this person? And they sent the person to America.
And something else to keep in mind, and Jens had talked about this too, there's been a lot of research, they call them the Letters from America. There's a series of books about this as well. But what happened as well, because the agents would go over and recruit, and they'd kind of send them in certain directions, and then they get here, there'd be some of these church organizations, other groups that would kind of get them help too. But a lot of times they were writing letters back home that would be read in church. So people would know, oh, okay, so this area west of Minneapolis or west of Mankato, if I can get to Mankato and I can get out to this town, I know there's going to be other people from the Hallingdale area or some other place from the Telemark region. Where I live, when I drive over to St. Olaf, there's a Telemark Road and there's a Telemark Hill and stuff like that too. So you can kind of start to concentrate as well.
I've got a question. When the steamships come into Canada, there's a port of entry, and I assume that they get information in terms of arrival in Canada. So you mentioned that there's a steamship that comes down the Minnesota River, and it can only go so far because of a bend. So when immigrants come into the United States through the Minnesota River, is there some kind of an immigration place there where they actually record their names and everything?
That any kind of recording that we are aware of would have happened at like an Ellis or some other kind of port of entry, I should say.
Right.
When they got here, no, it was set up, and then there were a series of shops that would sell things to the immigrants, saying, "Oh, here's that wagon you were looking for, here's that farm equipment and clothing and stuff like that. But no, there's no documentation like who would have gotten off the steamship here in Mankato.
So there's no information about that. That's
No.
quite interesting. So they could come into the United States and there'd be no record that they entered the United States, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My husband's grandfather came to the US as like a teenager, and he came indentured. Are there any records about people who came indentured as to who sponsored them, who paid their ticket?
Well, Jens, I don't know of anything on our end that would have said something like that, especially after the colonial period in the United States. Before the colonial period, coming from England, you would have had that kind of information, but I don't know afterwards. Jens, was there anything on your end that you can think of?
I'm a bit unsure. You said, what was the word you used?
Indentured. It means somebody paid his
it-
ticket and got him here, and he had, I think he had to work for this farmer in Illinois for 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know. I don't know about records about that, but there were records on, as you showed also, Kyle, about the ships, and at least in certain periods. I don't think these archives are covering the 100%, but there are what we call emigration protocols that that they take the names of people who are traveling out of the Norwegian ports. But I don't think that those sources are 100%. They don't cover everyone in a way. And sometimes it's well done and sometimes not. And of
Another
course,
challenge that can be to genealogy is that sometimes when the folks came to a particular Norwegian area, they would change their name to fit in with the Norwegians that were there. Norwegians had a propensity, it seemed like, to get their names moved around Norway. So it wasn't an unusual thing for them to do. But that's to find family when they may not retain the name that they came to.
A couple of things. One, going back to, I think it was Gary was asking before. I know some genealogists have kind of done the research to find out once they got to the port of entry where you find the manifest, and then once they know where they got to, they'd show up in church records and census records and stuff like that, but nothing in between there too. And Dave, I think you're just talking here too. I thought this was interesting. I just found this out recently. It's been a story for a very long time. Actually, my family used to use it too because my mom's maiden name was changed. So I've seen the trunk that my great grandfather brought over, and the way he spelled his last name on that is different than the way my mom spells it now. And so the story we always were told, and what we always told everybody else was, well, when he got here to like an Ellis Island or whatever the port of entry was, they changed it because they couldn't pronounce it properly. Well, we know now because of the manifests and luggage and all this other stuff, their names were already written out. So people were just copying those names. There wasn't anybody there randomly just changing names. A lot of people from Eastern Europe have made that claim here too. But what we discovered is when they moved, where they finally got to their final location, that's usually when the name change came in.
I'd like to make a comment about the name changes.
Mhm.
When my grandpa Ingvald came here, he was behind a bunch of Swedes, and he figured the INS people were pretty stupid. So he changed the last name from Torgerson, S-E-N, to S-O-N. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm a Roman Catholic, and I'm lazy, so I go to the Spanish Mass often. And the guy's Spanish was so bad, I said, "Are you part Norwegian?" He says he was. He was a Torgerson, but with the S-E-N still there, because that was his mom's name.
Okay.
A question, no. Question on, you were saying that people were sent over because they were dependent or questionable economic status. Did you ever track how these people fared in the United States, or if they're coming to the United States improve their economic status?
I think from my understanding, for the most part, yes, with the mentality of when they left Norway, they had nothing. So coming here and getting a farm and, being self-sustainable was seen as an improvement. Not that they were all becoming gentry of the upper middle class or anything else like that too. And then real quickly, I'll share with my own family history. My great grandfather had an interesting situation. He was the illegitimate son of the man who owned the farm and the handmaiden who was there. And so when he got to be old enough, it got to a point where he wasn't going to get any land from his biological father. He wasn't the son of the other man whose mom married afterwards there. So in the 1880s, there weren't a whole lot of options for him at that point in time. So coming to the US was like the option that he had to go with.
Did the Norwegian government ever try to discourage immigration to the United States, or was it?
Yeah,
fairly neutral?
there was a huge debate in Norway going on kind of in the second half of the 19th century about immigration, and some people definitely tried to do that. I think the government's policy, it was kind of biased to it. In some periods, they might have wanted to limit the immigration. In other periods, they thought it was okay. So it doesn't seem to be like a consistent line on it, but in periods, yes. And there were people, of course, who worried because a lot of during the highest level of immigration, I think up to 1/3 of the what you call the yearly what's that word? How many people are born every year? Up to 1/3 of them kind of emigrated. So that was pretty high numbers, and then of course people started worrying. But as you saw earlier on, these things, it was in the immigration happened in waves in a way, and much of it at times when things in Norway was not so good when it came to economy and so on.
There was some incidents of people going back, I think, after they originally.
Yes, I think around 20. It's calculated around 25% of those who emigrate goes back to Norway. Yeah, so quite a few people returned, and later on in emigration in the 20th century, it's pretty normal for people to emigrate for a period of time and work, and then move back to Norway. But that's kind of, we didn't really focus so much on that. But also that happened earlier, that people went there for some years, worked, and came back.
My grandfather originally came in about 1893 or so. He was like 16 or 17 years old. Lived in Iowa for, I think, 5 or 6 years, became a citizen, and then went back to Norway. Worked for a while, got married, and then came back to the United States. So he's kind of both ways.
Yes, I think that's also, people could go several times.
Did they, people who came, especially like in the 19th century, did they send money back to Norway?
That's a good question. I think they surely sent money back to get more people to go, like to pay for tickets and so on. It's a very good question. I'm not sure about the answer on that, but I have not heard that it was common to do so. Of course, it might have happened, but it's a very good question. And I cannot give a very, very good answer on it. But it's
one thing that's going to set the Norwegian and Scandinavian immigrants apart a little bit from some of the other countries that are sending over is that they're more of a mentality to bring a family. You see more husbands, wives, children being brought over rather than just like some other societies were mostly sending their young men who were either going to work and then bring somebody over later, or they're going to work for a while and then head back to their native homeland at that point in time here. So.
Were young Norwegian women sent over to the US to get married?
Jens, do you have any reports of that?
I think I don't can't exactly tell now the percentage of women emigrating, but I think it's pretty high. If they actually went to America to marry, I wouldn't be surprised that arrangements like that could have been done pre-emigration. That, you know, they had a cousin in America and that had a farm, or I don't know, something, you know. I don't know if it was very normal. I'm not sure. But,
my great-grandparents were both ministers, and they were always having a girl from Norway. And actually my grandfather as well, when he was at St. Olaf, they always had a girl from Norway, and they would rotate it through. After a year or so, they'd get them established, they'd often get married and go off, and then another girl would come from Norway. So there was a steady pipeline through the church ministry of young women.
Yeah, related question. I guess my great grandmother came actually from very near in Telemark as a single woman, and she was a Tjenis to Pika, I guess. As far as I can tell, and there is a ship's manifest and so forth. She immigrated by herself, not with family members, although she did have siblings who had already come several years earlier, actually. I mean, is that likely at all that she would travel alone as say a 20-something-year-old woman? Do you know of instances of that? I found that unlikely, but maybe she had friends or something. But could you comment on that?
Jens, I'll jump in first and I'll pass.
yes, please.
I did put in my colleague who I showed on my very first slide, Dr. Lori Lallam. She's an expert on women, Norwegian American immigrant and stuff like that. So that would be her area of expertise. I know in our class we came across some stories. I had a student who was doing some research on it. Jens, I'll let you chime in here if you have different thoughts on this as well. I don't think it was horribly uncommon, but it also didn't fall into the category of here come hundreds of Norwegian women. I think you were able to find it, but just not like, boy, here's the wave of 1,000 women are going to come over. Jens, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, my impression is the same. I cannot go, I don't know the details about it, but my impression is just like yours, Kai.
Yeah, I mean, this was early too, it was the 1850s. And she ended up marrying somebody who was actually from Valdres and, not from her district, but she did marry almost within a year of arriving. But I don't know if that would have been arranged. Perhaps not.
I think, as you said before, that it's probably pretty common that they know someone there.
Right.
That they kind of, even if it's probably family, but maybe not family, maybe someone from the same village, or that they would know someone, so they know where to go in a way. I would guess that's pretty common, at least.
I think there were women who traveled separately. My grandfather came over and then sent for his wife and their 1-year-old child.
Mm-hmm.
And they came over on the ship by themselves. Mm-hmm. So there were women that traveled in with their children to join their husband. But the other information that we've talked about in the past was that some of the men came over and never sent for their wife. And that created a problem in Norway for these women times are hard, so it was a difficult situation for them to be left in.
Can I make a comment about the women emigrating from Norway to the United States? One of my fellow members of the Sons of Norway of DC wrote a book about I guess it was his aunt who came from Norway. She got tired of milking goats, and she just came by herself.
So the moral of that story is goats are a lot of fun for college kids until you have to milk them twice a day, every day.
Petting zoo is fine. Work is not that much fun.
Yeah, that book is I Couldn't Milk Another Goat by Paul Arneson. And I think if you might have noticed that talk is on the YouTube section of the website, if you want to hear it. I
was going to comment real quickly too about something that was said, and I mentioned this real earlier, but the fact that some of the letters that were being sent home would be read by the minister in church as kind of like an announcement of the day, and they'd read the letters, which I think encouraged a lot of people. And I don't know if there's a Norwegian term for this, but we came across this American fever, where all these young people were leaving at that point in time. And I apologize too, Joel, I sent that the book just to you. Would you mind forwarding that to everybody else, or you want me to write it up again?
No, I can do it.
Okay, thank you.
Some of these letters also they were printed in newspapers in Norway. That was also a way to spread the information.
Now that's really helpful to me, because I've come across many cases where I had to believe letters were going back to Norway because people not necessarily DNA related but lived nearby were showing up in groups in the same towns or the same counties or the same townships, things like that. Like, how, you know, it was kind of a mystery. I had to believe that word of mouth was getting back to Norway, and the people were showing up in the same neighborhood. They came from the same neighborhood and they showed up in the same neighborhood. And that would make sense if these letters are being printed or read aloud in church, and that takes care of that. That's helpful. Something else that came to mind about the women, there's a book called The Wedding Dress, written by, I'm from Minnesota, a local woman about her mother who came as a single woman, that might be of interest to some people. Also, my great grandmother, one of them came at about 12 or 13 years of age from the Bergen area, and she did not come with her parents. She appeared to be a servant to another family with younger children, and she was probably the nanny, if you will, for that family, and came and lived with that family for a period of time. Her family, her parents and her siblings, did ultimately show up in the same county in Illinois eventually. But I can never really figure out all that story. Another thing was, how did they feed themselves on this trip across the ocean? And another thing was, if there were immigrants before 1800, what would be that circumstance? Would they be whalers, or that would be really unusual, I think.
I'll take the second part, Jens, if you want to.
Yeah, okay, please start.
Packing. So the first Norwegian immigrants that we saw came from 1825 on board the ship, the slooper, the Restoration. So that's what we know of as the beginning of it. And I believe they're going to settle in New York, and majority of it was more of a religious reason at that point in time to leave Norway and to come here. So that was probably the original purpose. Jens, do you know anything about the packing that they had?
Yeah, I think when it came to food, it was pretty common to actually bring quite a lot of the food with them. And at least maybe this changed during, like, later on in emigration, it was more common to maybe buy food more, but they brought pretty much with them. And that was, what is it called in, like, this not suitcase they brought with them, but
the trunks?
wood, trunks of wood, yeah. And that was one of the things they had in these trunks. It was food, basically. So you know, things that could stay for time, like flatbread or like salted meat, like meat, or, you know, things, dried things, salted things that could stay. So they brought pretty much of the food with them, actually. Of course, they must have bought something on the way, I guess. But
at the Vesterheim Museum, when you walk into the main room, off to the side, they had a list that somebody had written down of the things that they were supposed to bring. And I memorized these because they were sugar, bread, brandy were the top three things that they thought that you should go ahead and bring, which made me call my mother immediately and say, you are about as Norwegian as you can get, because that's the three things that she survives on too. So
Just a plug, we're having, the lodge is going to have a talk on the restoration. And it's going to be the June meeting, and we're having someone from the Vesterheim Museum give the talk, and that'll be at the regular lodge meeting. So hope everybody can attend. So.
Well, I wanted to thank both of the speakers. I thought the presentation was very interesting. I was interested in the content, but I was also very interested in the project itself, because I taught at George Washington University, and I taught academic English to international students. And I started doing similar projects to yours back in the 1990s. And we started out basically organized exchange with professors in various places in the world. And we started out with email. So the only technology we had to use was email. And then the World Wide Web came along. And then I retired before Zoom came along. But I did a lot of interesting projects. And one of my favorites was with a colleague in Siberia. And so I did, lots of different topics and different groups, a lot of European universities. So I think I was considered on the bleeding edge back then, because I was one of the first people to start doing projects like that with students. And so I'm wondering, what is your next project? Are you going to do another project together, the two of you?
We are working, we've got a grant submitted, and I'm hoping that in May, we're hopefully going to hear back. This is the bigger grant. So Jens and we're going to try to do the same class again, but Jens, do you want to talk about some of the other things we're hoping to do?
Yeah, I think basically we would like to do much of the same, but just more. So we will have a class also co-taught. Kyle, you and another colleague of mine, you will have a class with teachers, I think it is, yeah? Because we want to focus on teachers as a group, since we both run teacher education programs, and to work on maybe curriculum development and so on. Maybe you can say a bit about that, Kyle. Except from that, also we want to give more scholarships to students to go both ways, both on a bachelor level, but also on a master degree level, so that they can do maybe also some research while they are in the other country.
Yeah, I think they're wonderful projects for students. They're experiences that they'll never forget.
Yeah, one thing we got started, it was kind of an offshoot of the original plan. We've been very successful at this, is we have a student teaching abroad experience now. So students from USN have been able to come to Mankato, and Mankato's been able to send some students over to Southern Norway to do some of their field experiences, which every student I've ever had has said it's been life-changing having that opportunity to do something like that. And then another colleague that Jens was talking about and I, we're going to try to get teachers together from Norway and from the US with the hope of teaching each other about our history, looking at our immigration, our common path here, and with the idea of trying to get more Norwegian history brought into the American schools.
And the vice versa.
Yeah.
We can also maybe mention that we in this project also want to include the teachers at especially high school level, I think more, so that it will also be possible for teachers at high schools that are involved in the project with having students coming over and visit their classes to also go and visit schools in the other country. So we try to kind of reach out more than we did in the previous project. We also will involve some internship opportunities if students are going to study at the other universities. So both in America and in Norway, we made deals with the museums so that the students are not only being a student, but they also can do internships in museums in the other country, which hopefully will give them an even better experience.
Yeah, we sent a graduate student from Mankato over and worked at one of the Viking museums.
Yes.
in that region over there. And he's still talking about that. It's been a couple of years now, and he's still. Hey, Jens, I got a message from one of the people here directly to me. And I'm going to ask the question to you, and maybe we can help answer this for them. Could you mention some of the major differences between the educational systems in the two countries? the things we ran into along the way?
Maybe first, maybe we can mention that one of the things when we brought the Norwegian students to Mankato, it was you arranged a meeting, Kyle, with also other teacher students in Mankato. Maybe can you say a few words about that first?
Yeah, that was I would call it the most enlightening part of our trip. Literally, the students were just sitting around talking to each other, and some colleagues of mine from the Department of Education came in, and they just kind of got to ask some questions along the way. The one thing that I think stood out, and I still talk to my students about this, is that when Jens and I were doing the syllabus, one of the concerns that we have is the grading system. We both have, and Jens, correct me if I'm wrong, you have A, B, C, D, and F as well?
We have the E also.
E as well, okay.
Yeah, and then F.
In our conversation, what we discovered is that we tend to grade differently on both sides of the Atlantic here. American students are very, very, very used to getting A's. I asked my students in class, if you brought a B home, what are your parents going to say, and what's the reaction with a C? And they all kind of said, no, C's are not accepted whatsoever. It's all A's and B's here. What we discovered, and I'll let Jens chime in on this too, is that it's much, much, much more common for the Norwegian students to get C's, and the A's and B's are very, very rare. So we had a lot of fear from the American side of, okay, if we're going to work with these Norwegians, what kind of grades are they going to end up giving us if we have to do something else like that too? But Jens, did you kind of see the same thing?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing with the grades. I'm looking at the question also, and I think if I can add a few other things. I think for our Norwegian students, one of the things they noticed most is that it's when how can I say this? The structure of teacher and classroom is very different, because in Norway it's basically well, let's say in America, it's the teacher who has a classroom, and the students have to go from to his or her classroom to the teacher's classroom. So they go to different classrooms. In Norway, the students most of the time have a classroom assigned for the class, and then the teachers are moving between the classrooms. So it's kind of opposite. So while also like in America, often the teacher has his desk or her desk in the classroom, while in Norway, then the teacher will have a workplace somewhere else together with the other teachers. So this is kind of quite a big difference actually in the school day, because the way the students in schools, in high schools move around, and middle schools move around at school it's kind of different. The other thing I was thinking about is that I think we worked in America and in Norway with public schools, like public run schools. So in at the high schools and middle schools, I think it's also a lot of similarities. But of course, when students go to universities, there are huge differences. Most of all, I think the difference is about the financiation system, because in Norway, universities are free. It's public financed, and in America, it's not, or less. So, so that's of course a huge difference for students in that sense.
The last thing I noticed too was how often, even with my student teachers who are working more in their high schools as compared to our high schools too, and Jens and I had to deal with this a little bit in terms of assignments. In the United States, we do a lot of little projects and simulations and worksheets and stuff like that along the way. In Norway, Jens, would you say the focus is more towards the end with the bigger assignment, the research paper?
Totally. It's a very good point, because it's something that the students immediately notice. And I also know when American students come to visit our university, it's one of the things that they will comment on, because they don't have all these assignments all the time. So many of them are like what am I supposed to do in a way? I have all this time. And then you are basically supposed to sit down and read by yourself, the Norwegian students, when they come to the American universities, they will feel that, oh my God, it's so much to do all the time, because they are used to kind of having to focus on the final exam. So that's a big difference in the way it's done. And I mean, for my own, just talking for myself, I think that the Norwegian system has a lot to learn from the American system there, because I think it gives a lot to the students to work more on a permanent basis during the semester than our system that is much more focused on exams.
And I think it was something that both sides learned, because I know a lot of our students were going, I like what the Norwegians do about this and this. And so there's things that we can learn from each other. And in case all you're wondering, when the Norwegian students let my students know that college was free over there, I had about 17 students in the room who were required to immigrate back over to Norway real quickly. There's no question.
I'd actually like to make a comment about the system difference, because one of my daughters who was at Stanford went to the UK. The UK heavily influenced the way Norway's system worked. And the interesting thing is she didn't get anybody from the UK. They'd come from like Harvard or Yale to be teaching her. And my other daughter was there going to this gymnasium, so they would get together with each other. She was in France. It essentially computing. She'd already completed high school in the United States, so she wanted to repeat it there. So they bonded because they'd take the tube to go from France to the UK, and they shared experiences about that.
I think this is one of the main things with this teacher practice exchange thing we are doing, because both the students and hopefully and us as teachers and all of us, we are learning really a lot by looking at these differences and also the similarities, but to kind of get new ideas. I think it's very, very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we should.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just have one comment. Well, actually 2 comments, but no questions, no questions. I just want to make a comment. When I was younger in my day and married, and my husband was part of the Rotary, and they wanted someone to have an exchange student from Sweden to come and live with them. And I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And my husband said no. And I'm like, no, it's going to happen. I'm going to tell you, this guy came so naive, and that was 36 years ago, and we still stay in touch. So when I go to Norway, I always visit with him and his family. So your exchange programs with, whether it be Sweden students or Norway students, you've got to keep doing this. I mean, I learned so much from him. I learned how to cook Swedish food. I made him American food. It was the best experience of my life. And you've got anybody who questions it, no, you've got to do that. So encourage that exchange. So that's one comment. My other comment is, I am the social director of my Sons of Norway Restoration Lodge in Media, Pennsylvania. So I'm excited about this June program you will be doing on restoration. Will you be giving us some, pre-information so that I may be able to pass on to my lodge members?
Absolutely.
And I am done. I'm quoting, I'm out. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. We'll send you some information.
Well, let's give a big thank you to our speakers, Kyle Ward and Johan Hyvik.
Mankato.
Thank you so much for having us today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate this.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Talk.
Let me just put in one plug for our next meeting, which will be May 22nd. And it will be Dana Kelly, who's the executive director of the Norwegian-American Genealogical Center and Naismith Library in Madison. And she'll be talking a little bit about starting to prepare to tell your family story, your family history.